Thank you so much for being here. I am so excited to learn with all of you, or I should say all of y'all now that I live in the South. I'm just going to dive right in because we don't have like the most time in the world. And there's a lot of good meat in this week's Parsha. This week's Parsha is, of course, Parashat Ekev. Now, a lot of rabbis, when they talk about Parshat HaShavua, they'll pick on sort of one moment, one big thing in this Parsha, and they'll focus a deep dive into that. And we could certainly do that. There's enough in here. We could be doing that for weeks. But what I actually prefer to do is to look a little bit more big picture at what's going on holistically in the Parsha and to kind of see what's going on. But we often think of Torah as one unit, that Torah just kind of is all the same. And if we look really carefully, we'll notice it's really not. Oh, Sharon, can you put the link for the source sheet in the chat, please? Sorry, thank you so much. Sorry about that, everyone. There will be a source sheet. There's a link coming into the chat right now where you can find the source sheet. I'm also going to share all of the text on the screen as well. So if we look carefully, we'll notice that all 5 books of the Torah are certainly not the same, right? They don't tell the same things. They don't share the same points. And in fact, Devarim is special. And we have to remember where we are in the book of Deuteronomy in order to understand what's going on in Parashat Ekev. Because in the very beginning, our book opens up in chapter 1, verse 1, not our Parsha this week, Ele hadvarim asher diber Moshe el kol Yisrael. Asher diber Moshe. These are the words that Moses spoke. And in fact, this whole book is Moses speaking. It's not God. It's Moses, and that's going to be really important. And we have to remember also, who is Moses speaking to? Because this entire generation that he's talking to now in the book of Deuteronomy, as you learned a couple of weeks ago, they weren't there for the miracles in the desert. They weren't there to experience slavery in Egypt. That was their parents and their grandparents. So who Moses is speaking to is going to affect the way in which Moses speaks. And that's going to be really important for this week's Parsha. And we get that clarified even further in last week's Parsha, because in chapter 5, verse 1 in Parashat Ekev, we get Vayikra Moshe el kol Yisrael vayomer alehem. Moses, again, not God, Moses summoned all of the Israelites together and speaks to them. And Parshat Va'etchanan, as you learned last week, is a recounting. We get the 10 Commandments again and some highlights and a whole bunch of other stuff that's going on. A lot of recounting of the story of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. And in fact, we see that so clearly because the Sefer HaChinuch, the book that is the official enumeration of the number of mitzvot that will lay out what are the 613 mitzvot and where do they appear in the Torah. This book is called the Sefer HaChinuch. And it says that there are 2 new mitzvot given in the Parshat Devarim and 12 in Parshat Va'etchanan last week. And that's not even counting all of Parshat Yitro, which is being recounted in last week's Parsha, which is an additional 17 mitzvot. So Moses is giving a lot of commands here. Right? He's giving a lot of instruction throughout Devarim and Va'etchanan. But why? That's the question we have to ask. Why did Moses call this summit of the entire community? And why is Moses recounting everything that's already been said to their parents and grandparents? And what we realize, and what we're going to realize even more during Parshat Ekev, during our 45 minutes together, is that we are in the midst of Moses' speech. And Moses, we call Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe, our teacher. And Moshe is, having learned from God, a great pedagogue. He is the teacher of teachers, and we're going to see his strategy. We're going to see his teaching strategy as we move through this Parsha. So why does it matter that Moses is speaking and not God? And why does it matter to which generation Moses is speaking? We have to remember that the storyteller dictates the story. When we look at Torah, there are parts of it where we say, this is what God said. It is clear as day. There's no argument. This is it. Parashat Ekev is not one of those moments. In fact, the book of Deuteronomy is not one of those moments, because Moshe, as a storyteller, as a teacher, has something that everyone should learn. And so the minute details of exactly what he says, as we're going to see, are not going to be nearly as important as the message that he's trying to get across. And also the audience he's speaking to is going to matter. Those of you who have children, think about how you told stories to your little children when they were itty bitty versus when they became teenagers versus when they became adults. Think about how we speak to our colleagues when we think our audience is an expert in the same field as us versus a layperson who knows very little on the subject matter. Our audience matters. And we're going to see Moshe, our great teacher, take advantage of this. Somebody just put in the chat, Moshe is establishing the transmission of Torah as the Israelites go forward, as we see in Pirkei Avot, and absolutely 100%. And that transmission, I love. I used to work at Camp Ramah in Southern California, in Ojai, California. Loved working with my teenagers out there. That only stopped because of the pandemic. Another casualty of the pandemic was my job over there. But what I used to always say to my students over at Ramah, when we talk about transmission of Torah, is we talk about the game telephone, right? When you whisper something in someone's ear and they have to pass it along, and how it might get adjusted and changed, and you know, the goal of that game is to actually hold on to that original message. And if we get so focused on the minute details of every single word, there's no way we're going to hold on to that message. A group of 10-year-olds will show you in that game, it's not possible. But what is possible is to hold on to the spirit of it. And when you ask these children, you know, you can rework the message, but keep the idea the same. They do a lot better in the game. And that's exactly what Moshe is doing. But why? Again, why is that question? And we're going to see. We had to explore that. So enter Parashat Ekev. Okay, this is where our Parsha this week begins. And we have something very interesting. V'haya Ekev, tishme'un et hamishpatim, ha'ela ushmartem v'asitem otam, v'shamar Adonai Elohecha lecha et habrit, ve'et hachesed asher nishpa la'avotecha. We open right up, Moshe giving a command. If you obey God, if you obey the rules I'm about to set forward, the rules we just recapped in Et Chanan and Dvarim, then God will maintain this relationship that God has built with your ancestors. So what does that mean? Va'ahevcha uverachecha v'hirbecha. God will favor you and bless you and multiply you. Uveirach privitnecha upri admatcha degancha v'tiroshcha v'itarecha shagar alafecha v'ashtarot sonecha al ha'adama asher nishpa la'avotecha latet lecha. Right, that God will make everything wonderful for you. God will let you have lots of children, and the soil will be great, and the crops will be amazing, and your herds will do well, and you'll get all the land. This land that, remember, we're right outside of it at this point in the story. They can see it across the river, and you're going to get it. Right? But then here's where it gets really interesting. And this is where the first most dangerous part of paying too close attention to minute words can get us into trouble. Because verse 14 then says, Baruch tihiyeh mikol ha'amim. You will be blessed above all other nations, all other peoples. This is where we get the idea of the Jewish people as the chosen people. Right here, Parashat Ekev. And what does that mean to be chosen? Well, according to the verses right before it, it means that everything's going to be amazing 100% of the time. If we focus on every single word and we take that super literally, who buys that? Has anybody here led the most perfect life ever without any hardships whatsoever and never had anything wrong happen ever in the world? Like, come on. Clearly, that's not what Moshe is saying. But it gets even crazier. Because again, remember, this is Moshe speaking what does it mean to actually be chosen, to be blessed more than all other nations? Well, the next couple of verses go on to actually explain some of this. Now, somebody wrote in the chat here, the foundation of a covenant between the vassal and the Lord, and maybe that's what it is. Maybe it is just this sort of political hierarchy, this sort of royal bonds here. And yet, what Moses is going to actually explain the next couple things. Ooh, I love somebody just wrote chosen for a special task. We're going to see what that means in a second. But the next couple of verses make it very, very scary. And it says, "Ve'achalta et kol ha'amim asher Adonai Elohecha noten la." You will destroy, literally, ve'achalta is you will eat. You will destroy all the peoples which God is going to give you. Ve'lo tira mehem, and you're going to have no fear of them. Whoa! That's what it means to be chosen? That's what it means? We're going to be so superior that we're just going to walk in and wipe out everyone and we're just going to be the greatest? Is this military strength? Is that what it means to be chosen? But now Moses tips his hand because now we see the pedagogy coming in. Because after Moses says, you shall have no fear of them, Moshe says, because all you have to do is remember all of the miracles God has already done for you in Egypt and what God did to the Egyptians, which asher ra'u einecha, that you, singular, or plural, second person, you saw with your own eyes. But they didn't. They didn't see Egypt with their own eyes. This is the next generation. They weren't there. So what is happening here? Moshe is not being literal. Moshe is not saying to us, you are chosen and therefore everything's going to be amazing and you're going to destroy everyone else. That's not the message. Those are the words, but that's not the message. And we know that because Davka, absolutely, certainly, Moshe is speaking allegorically here. You saw it with your own eyes. In the same way that every Passover, we say to one another around the Seder, you were at Sinai. Not your ancestors, you were there. Right? Have that emotion, have that feeling. And Moshe's done it. He's brought them into that emotional place where they need to be for what's to follow with everything he said so far. That's what Moshe is trying to do. He needs to put them into a mindset to listen to what is coming next. But why? Question, you saw is like y'all. Southerners say your mama and them. So in this verse, the y'all, so Hebrew does have a word for y'all. It has a plural conjugation. And this is it. We know this because it has this yud in between the nun and the chaf sofit here. So this is, yes, this is you saw with y'all's own eyes in this particular verse. Y'all saw it with y'all's own eyes. Ra'u is a plural and einecha is there. But what he's not saying is your parents saw it. Still talking directly second person. So why? What's going on here? How do we get this chosen-ness? Because in the beginning, Moshe just says, obey the commands. Well, he's got to elaborate on that because chosen-ness, despite what we might have thought from glancing through the Torah, is conditional. This is not an automatic thing. This is not, we're just born and chosen and everything's wonderful. Right? Oh, we're going to get to the second part of the Shema a little bit later. I see that in the chat. Yes. This is conditional. Kol ha-mitzvah asher anochi metzavcha hayom tishmerun la'aso. You have to observe the mitzvot. Urvitem uvatem virishtem et haaretz asher nishba Adonai la'avotechem. You have to actually do the things and then you will possess the land. Remember, they're right outside of it. They're not even in Eretz Yisrael yet. They're not in Canaan. He says you have to do something. And in fact, doing it is not going to be easy. V'zacharta, remember, et kol haderech asher holichecha Adonai Elohecha, ze arba'im shana bamidbar. You didn't just come from Egypt yesterday. We've been traveling for 40 years. Why do you think an 11-day journey took us 40 years? Lema'an anotcha, lenasotcha, leda'at et asher bilvavecha, hatishmor mitzvotav im lo. The reason is because God has to test you. You have to earn it. It's not easy. God subjected you to the hardship of hunger and gave you manna to eat. None of you had ever known that. In order to teach you that mankind does not live on bread alone, Al kol motza pi Adonai yichya adam, but that mankind may live on anything that God gives you. Simlatcha lo valta me'alecha veraglecha lo vatzeka ze arba'in shana. In all these 40 years of wandering, your clothes didn't wear out, your feet didn't swell. You were taken care of. But not because you just automatically get it all. Somebody said the words are a little bit blurry. You can definitely access the sort sheet. It's got all of the same text. Just click on the link in the chat, and you can get all of those on a PDF that you can keep for yourself as well. But it's not because you just get it. And God was testing you, but testing you and at the same time taking care of you. V'yadata im levavecha ki ka'asher yeyaser ish et beno Adonai Elohecha miyasreka. Because God disciplines you just like a parent disciplines a child. Just because God loves you, just because God is going to take care of you, just because you have a connection with God does not mean you are free to do whatever you want. And you just experienced it for the last 40 years in the desert. Now, this idea of God testing the people, testing the righteous, testing those that God loves is actually not new to Torah. We're going to sidestep Parashat Ekev for just a moment and go all the way back to the book of Genesis, because who was the special relationship with God? Who kicked off this whole Israelite journey? Our ancestor of ancestors, we have Avraham Avinu. And in chapter 22 of the book of Genesis, in verse 1, we get Vayehi achar hadvarim ha'ela v'ha'elohim nisa et Avraham. God tests Abraham. Who knows chapter 22? Anybody want to type in the chat? Where are we in Genesis here? What is the test? The infamous test. We've got Yom Kippur coming up soon.
The sacrifice.
The sacrifice of Isaac, the Akedah, beautiful. Absolutely. This is what was going on. And the rabbis go nuts over this. They go, whoa, whoa, whoa. Abraham was the righteous one. Abraham was the only monotheist in the world. Why did God need to test him? And they give three answers in Breshit Rabbah, in Genesis Rabbah, in a book of Midrash. And the three answers they give, Rabbi Yochanan says, when a flax worker's flax is defective, right, the stuff you make grain, the grain you make bread out of, he does not, or clothing out of, he does not beat it very much because it splits. But when the flax is good, he beats it a lot. Well, for those of you that are not flax workers and don't know how it works, Rabbi Yochanan explains, why does he beat it? Because beaten flax grows better. So too, the Kadosh Baruch Hu does not test the wicked, because the wicked can't withstand the punishment and they would break. And God cares about everyone, says Rabbi Yochanan. He goes on, Rabbi Yochanan says, when a potter checks his kiln, I don't know if we got any potters in the room, you don't check the faulty instruments. You don't break all of the stuff that are fragile. It's just enough to beat it once until he breaks it. And what does he check? The pitchers that he knows were made really, really well, because even if he taps it a few times, even if he beats it a couple times, he knows it's not going to break. And Rabbi Elazar finishes it out. He says, regarding the master of the house who has two cows, and one is really strong and one is really weak, which one is he going to put the yoke on? Which one is he going to have do all of the field work? Does he not give the yoke upon the cow with good strength? Now, this is not necessarily we could sit here and unpack this theology of God testing the righteous and God only giving you what you can handle. We could sit here and have an entire, 10-hour conversation of just about that concept. But what's important to take away here is that this notion of God testing the ones God loves is not new to Torah. And it's not new to Moses. Moshe, who has been through absolute hell and back in this entire journey, this people who literally watched their parents be unworthy of entering the land of Israel. They know what it's like to be tested. They know what it's like to go through hardships. All the while, Moshe saying to everyone, that doesn't diminish God's love for you or God's relationship with you. But chosenness is conditional. So how do we get it? How do we get that chosenness? How do we stay in God's good graces? Our chapter continues in this. Now we're back in Parashat Ekev in verse 6 of, I think we were in chapter 8. Yep, we're in chapter 8 here, verse 6. V'shamarta et mitzvot Adonai Elohecha lalechet bidrachav u'yir'a oto. So keep God's commandments and walk in God's ways and revere God. Ve'achalta v'savata. And when you've eaten your fill, and when you are satiated, uveirachta et Adonai Elohecha al ha'aretz hatova asher natan lach. This right here is actually the only command for prayer in the entire Torah. This is the prayer, the commandment for Birkat Hamazon, the blessing after a meal. And Moshe, and it comes from Moses, again, not God, from Moses, who says, what does it mean to follow God's ways? What does it mean to build this relationship with God? It means that when there's something good in your life, when you are satiated, when you have what you need, you turn around and you thank God. That you say, I acknowledge that this came from God. Just as the manna that Moshe just recounted about sustained the people through the desert. And Moshe continues. Because when you do well, it's more than just thanking God. It's more than just acknowledging God had a role. It's knowing that God had the role. V'amarta bilvavecha kochi ve'otzem yadi oseli et hachayil hazeh. Do not say to yourselves, my own power and might of my own hand has won this wealth for me. V'zacharta et Adonai Elohecha ki hu anoten lecha koach la'asot chaya lema'an hakim et brito asher nishba la'avotecha kayom hazeh. Remember that it's God who gives you the power to get wealth. And that ability to even do well in the world is because God is fulfilling this relationship that God started with your ancestors. And someone wrote here in the chat something that I really would love to highlight here. Thank you. Wrote, amazing how God does not ask for thankfulness, but Moshe does. Right? Is this also a precedent for the human role in understanding God's word? I love that question. That's an absolutely wonderful question. I don't want to say definitively that this is the precedent, but absolutely this notion of sorry, I lost the question there, of understanding human role of the human role in understanding God's words is crucial, right? Moshe is the one who is giving this story to the next generation. And we still haven't gotten to why yet, and that's coming up really, really soon. But Moshe is the one doing this. This is not God saying to the new generation. God already did it. He did it at Sinai. He told their parents. He told their grandparents. Isn't that enough? Right? Teach it to your children. Pass on the words. No. And yet Moshe feels responsible to say, hold on, I'm going to come in here. And as you saw in the book of Devarim, I'm even going to tweak the story a little bit. Moshe doesn't really tell it word for word how it happened in Vayikra and Shemot and Bamidbar. But absolutely this human role in understanding God's words. And thankfully, we still have this rich tradition of rabbis who sit with this text every single day and turn it, hafuchva, v'hafuchba, v'kulaba, right? Pirkei Avot. Turn it, for everything can be found within it. So there's a question here about where does the praying before meals come from? This kosi revaya, my cup runneth over. Well, kosi revaya, that actually comes from the book of Psalms. So when we talk about Torah versus Tanakh versus all of Scripture, we're talking about Torah and prophets and writing. So when I say this is the only part about tefillah in the Torah, all I mean is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. There's a lot more in the books of prophets and the books of writings that has to do with prayer and giving thanks and blessings. But in Torah, in these 5 books, this direct from God conversation, this is it. And it comes from Moses. And somebody wrote, I'm amazed at the transformative power of Torah, right? Moshe started out telling God that he's not a man of words. And yet here he is with the largest book, well, not the largest book of the Torah, but the largest soliloquy in Torah, giving you the entire book of Devarim as a man of words. It's amazing the kind of growth we have as humans and the potential we have. But it gets scarier because Moshe says, not only do you need to do it, don't fail, because failure comes with consequences. The most common warning to the entire people of Israel, it happens over and over and over again, don't serve other gods. And don't bow down to them. This Hebrew doubling, avod tovedun, aleph vet dalet, it's repeated twice in a row. It signifies a strength of statement. Surely you will be lost. Kagoyim asher Adonai ma'avid mipnechem kain tovedun ekev lo tishmeun bekol Adonai Elohechem. Just like the nations that God is causing to disappear before you, so too will you perish. Now that is some intense imagery. Remember, this is a people on the edge of going into the land of Canaan, and they already know they're going to have to conquer it. They already know there's going to be peoples who are going to stand in their way and fight them tooth and nail for the land. When we see military movies, right? When we see the great, theatrical, epic battle scenes, right? Think 300 and Sparta, right? We get these generals who stand up and say, we're undefeatable, we're invincible, you're the greatest, go in and kill everyone. And Moshe here is saying, hey, you know those people that you're about to wipe out? Yeah, they're human, just like you. Guess what? What we're going to try to do to them could happen to you at absolutely any moment in time. Whoa. What a way to humanize where they are. What a way to remind people of God's power and might. And this is great foreshadowing. There's a really great question in the chat I'm going to come back to in just a second here. But I want to see this foreshadowing of what Moshe is about to do, because the very next thing he's going to answer is, how can we both be chosen as well as tested harshly with the possibility of horrible failure? How is it that Moshe can turn to us and say, you're going to be blessed among all other people, but only if you do this thing properly? And even when you do it properly, God's going to test you. So there's a great question here. So the question asked most often, how do we explain in the early demise of good people who follow God's words and are given kind, and the long lives of those who do not adhere to the midot of Torah, right? What's going on here with this relationship between following God and being blessed versus why do bad things happen to good people, right? And we have to remember here that, again, a couple things. Number one, this is not God talking. This is Moses talking. Number two, Moshe is speaking allegorically. And number three, Moshe is speaking to the people, Israel, on the whole. Nothing in what Moshe has said so far has been, if you, individual person, are good, you'll live forever and never have a hard life. In fact, the opposite. Moses says, we're all going to be tested. Every one of us. Life is hard. And the way you get that relationship with God is not by not being tested or not having a hard life. The way you get that relationship is by, when the good things happen, when the blessings happen in your life, you turn around and thank God for it. Now, does that mean you can't yell at God when bad things happen? By all means, yell at God when bad things happen. That's perfectly legitimate. Far be it from me to tell you that I never yell at God, for sure. But if you're going to yell at God for the bad, we also have to thank God for the good. And so what we learn here about chosenness is something really, really, really important. And if you remember nothing else from what I've said today, remember this from Parashat Ekev, that chosenness has nothing to do with superiority. Because remember, Moshe just said to the people Israel, you could be wiped out by God just as easily as the people that God is about to wipe out on your behalf. God could make you the enemy just as easily as God has made these people in Canaan your enemy. Al tomar bilvavcha bahadof Adonai Elohecha otam milfanecha lemor betzid kati heviani Adonai lareshet et haaretz hazot. When God has thrust your enemies from your path, do not say to yourselves, God did this because we are awesome. God did this on our merit. Don't say that. God's not doing it for you. Uvrishat hagoyim ha'ela Adonai morisham mipanecha. God is displacing peoples who broke that relationship with God. That it's their wrongdoings that is causing that is causing them to be wiped off. It is not because of your virtues and rectitude that you'll be able to possess the country. It's because of their wickedness that Adonai is disposing those nations before you. And in order to fulfill the oath that Adonai has made to your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that's why you get to go in. You've done nothing to earn this. You wandered in a desert with parents who failed a test. And yet God is going to displace this people anyway. And you get to go in because God has this prior relationship with the people as a people. A very different notion than what we think about when we think about being chosen, as being given the land. This is the same theology, by the way, that allowed the Jewish people to survive the destruction of the Second Temple. Whereas so many nations, when they lose their temple for their gods, they said, clearly our gods were defeated and the religion vanishes and the culture vanishes. But when the Jews lost their temple in the diaspora in 70 CE, we turned around and said, no, God destroyed God's own home to teach us a lesson. Right? The same notion here. So know then that it's not for any virtue of yours that God is giving you this good land to possess, because you are a stubborn people. Am kashe oref ata. You are stubborn. Now I'm sure we all know from personal experience, either ourselves or others in our lives, that Jewish stubbornness, and I'm certainly guilty of that myself, and that's okay. But let us not think that stubbornness, that those mistakes that we've made along the way are going to somehow make us, some virtuous, amazing, altruistic people. It's not about that. And Moses then goes on, and for the sake of time, I'm going to speed up just a little bit here. And Moses goes on to then expound to this next generation all the ways their parents and grandparents screwed up in the desert. And then Moshe does something really interesting. He emphasizes his own role in saving the people over and over and over again. At Sinai, he has to argue for the people because they built a golden calf. When Miriam and Aaron start bad-mouthing the people, Moshe has to come to bat for them. When the spies go in and screw up, Moshe has to come to bat to the people. Va'et palel el Adonai, va'omar Adonai Elohim, al tashchet amcha benachalatcha asher padita bigadlecha asher hotzeta mimitzrayim biyad chazaka. I, Moses, prayed to Adonai and said, God, please don't destroy your very own people. The implication here being that God wanted to destroy them, right? They were not magically chosen and virtuous and wonderful. God repeatedly wanted to kill the people and start over, and even said to Moses, I'll start over with you. And Moshe tells this next generation, I stood up for you. Now, is Moses doing that because Moses just likes to brag? Like, look how awesome I am? Why is it that Moses is telling them? Because Moses knows he's not going to be around. They can't rely on Moses stepping in anymore. The entire book, is all about Moses' swan song. Moses is saying to people, to this generation, I'm not here anymore. You have to actually learn how to build this relationship with God on your own. So how do we do that? What are we supposed to do? And chapter 10 and 11 finishes with Moshe's instruction. Oh, my camera just turned off. That was weird. Okay, I'll get that back on. We can still hear me though, hopefully. And Ve'ata Yisrael. And now, Israel. Ma Adonai Elohecha sho'el me'imach. What does God want from you? Im liyira et Adonai Elohecha lalechet bechol derachav ul ahava oto. Walk in God's path and love God. For God is supreme. And God shows no favor and takes no bribe. But God upholds the fatherless and the widow and befriends the stranger, providing them with food and clothing. Va'ahavtem et hager ki gerim hayitem be'eretz Mitzrayim. So too must you act, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. What does it mean to love God? It means to act like God, to love the stranger, especially in this world of increasing hatred and divisiveness. Deuteronomy and Parashat Ekev has a lesson to teach us. If you want to be chosen, if you want to feel a part of this relationship with God, you have to act godly, and that means love. And I want to share with you something that one of my beloved teachers, Rabbi Elliot Dorff, speaks about all the time. And this is a particular passage from an amazing book series called My People's Prayer Book. This is from the book called Welcoming the Night, page 61 on Ahavat Olam. And somebody wrote absolutely correctly, love goes hand in hand with serve, right? In this piece right before, serve God and love, i.e. you must do both. You must act with love, not just have love in your heart. And Rabbi Elliot Dorff teaches us something beautiful about love. He says, God loves us by giving us instruction, the literal meaning of Torah, and commandments as to how we should live, how we should act. This is akin to the relationship between human parents and children. One of the primary ways in which parents express their love is by establishing and enforcing reasonable rules for their children. And I'm sure every parent here knows that to be true. The absence of such rules is not love, it's apathy. And even when children rail against the rules, enforcing them with care, concern, and energy is a clear and powerful expression of parental love. And what Rabbi Elliot Dorff is sharing with us is the message of Moshe Rabbeinu in Parashat Ekev. That when we look at the tests that God gives us, and we look at the hardships and the mitzvot and the commandments and all of the rules and everything that it means to be a Jew and to be part of this people and this tradition, and it's hard. It's hard to eat kosher. I live in Shreveport, Louisiana. You think I'm getting any kosher food out here? I'll tell you right now, it's hard, right? It's hard to keep Shabbat. Living in America when all of the sports are on Saturdays, are you kidding me? It's hard. And yet those rules are actually God's love. That's what God's giving us. And so what should we do? Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha. Love God, vishamarta mishmarto. Just as was said in the chat, right? You have to actually follow the rules. And we get this ending of chapter 11, the ending of our parsha is the second paragraph of the Shema, as someone alluded to earlier. V'haya'im shamoa tishma'u el mitzvotai. If you obey the commandments. And this section, this second paragraph of the Shema that we read twice a day, morning and night, when we rise up and when we go to bed, is a recap of this entire parsha, where the paragraph and the chapter in the Shema says, if you follow the commands, good things will happen. The world will turn the way it's supposed to turn. As a people, in the plural, not you singular, y'all plural, as a people, God will follow up with God's side of the agreement. And if you don't, God won't either. Now, that doesn't mean that nothing bad will ever happen to anybody who, keeps Shabbat and keeps kashrut. Of course not. We all have anecdotal life experience to teach us that's not true, right? But if we don't at least try, if we don't at least build that relationship with God, then how can we possibly expect God to have that relationship with us? So what does it mean to be chosen? It means that we have been given something that no one else has been given. And that's our Torah. That's that thing that all of you come every week, or at least many weeks, or maybe this is your first time here to study Parshat HaShavua. And Yasher Koach for doing it. Because only by reading the Parshas, the Parshiot, only by engaging with the struggle and difficulty of Torah, can we hear the words of Moshe Rabbeinu, this interpretation of what God has in store for us, and the journey that is nearly 3,500 years old, back from Avraham Avinu, to engage with God in a very real and meaningful way. So our responsibility as those who are chosen is to live up to God's standard of love of self, love of God, and love of the greater community and the stranger in our land. And as we go into the high holidays coming up in a few weeks, let's remind ourselves what it means to truly have love for the world and for the stranger. Because on Yom Kippur, we are asked by our sages to ask forgiveness to 3 people for the wrongs we've done: to ourselves, to God, and to the community. So let's start today with the lessons of Parashat Ekev to add just a little bit more love for the stranger into our lives every day. Yasher Koach, everyone. Thank you so much for learning with me, and to everyone who wrote in the chat. Just an absolute pleasure and privilege to be here. My website is freelancejudaism.com. If you have any questions whatsoever, you can find my email there. I would love to hear from you, and I'd love to learn with you.